We're going to change our attention a little bit to pests. And coming down here, Bill, we saw a lot of weeds growing. And could you give us some ideas on what our options may be?
Yes, am I coming through okay? So I'm Bill Johnson. I'm the extension weed scientist at Purdue. And the way I kind of, I guess, craft my comments for today is there's probably two 30,000 feet things for growers to think about as soon as the conditions dry out enough. And one is getting over these fields to get weeds controlled in fields where we have poor weed control. And one of the big challenges they're going to run into is the fact that the crop stages, although they're not growing very quickly, the crop stages and the weed stages have continued to advance, or the plants have continued to grow. And with many post-emerge herbicides, there are size restrictions based not only on the size of the crop, but also on the size of the weed. And so to give you a legal term, we will be making many off-label applications when the weather dries. So what the result of that could be poor weed control because we're spraying weeds that are too big based on the label. The other condition could be we are not getting good spray coverage because the crops have advanced to a growth stage in which they cover a lot of the soil. We won't be able to get the herbicide solutions to the plants. And particularly with corn, when we make applications, post-emerge spray applications later in the growth cycle of corn, we run some damage of, or we run some risk of causing a negative impact on ear fill. And so Bob and myself will get a lot of weird ears sent to us in the fall when we have situations like this with late herbicide applications. So what we're going to encourage growers to do is understand, if they have weeds to control, they have to read the label, they have to understand the risk of making this off-label application. And the risks are poor weed control or potentially some damage to corn ears. We run into less problems with late post-emerge treatments with beans. With beans, we can run into some issues when we get past about the R2 growth stage. But we have a little bit of time, I think. I think we have a little bit bigger window to deal with in beans as of right now than we do in corn. So that's one risk. The other issue that'll become pretty important is replanting areas that are drowned out. And I think that the more sensitive issue is what do we do with the drowned out areas in cornfields? My perception is that most likely guys will want to plant soybeans in the drowned out areas, even if it's in a cornfield. There are many corn herbicides that we use that have rather lengthy rotational intervals, meaning you have to wait a certain number of months before you can replant another crop in there. The most restrictive one, obviously, is atrazine. And I don't know what atrazine use is like now, but I assume it's somewhere in excess of 50% of the corn acres, maybe as high as 70 to 80% of the corn acres that still get atrazine. And the only crop that you can legally plant in an area treated with atrazine and harvest for grain or graze would be corn or grain sorghum. Okay, no other crop, according to the federal label, can be planted if it's harvested for grain or animals can graze it or use it for hay. The reality of the situation is that many of these growers will go ahead and try to plant beans in these areas. If they've had enough water to dilute the herbicide, they can still make a crop. But the legal answer is that they're not supposed to do that. If somebody ever checks for atrazine residues in the grain, they could be subject to some fines. So from a weed control standpoint, those are kind of the two, I guess, big picture issues, main issues that I've been dealing with as far as a lot of the questions that have been coming into my office.
Questions for Bill? Okay, thank you, Bill. We'll turn over to Christian Krupke to visit with us about insects.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So insects on the list of things for people to worry about this year, this spring and summer, are pretty far down on the list. That's the first thing to point out. But there are a couple of points to bring up, and one is for the corn crop that will survive this flooding. The most important pest we talk about when we talk about corn in the summer and the main part of the growing season is corn rootworm. And those rootworm eggs hatch every year around at the end of May, beginning of June. Those larvae look for a corn root to feed on, and then they take it from there. They're very susceptible to drowning, though. So they will drown long before the corn plant will. So some of those fields where you've had standing water for more than a day, which is a lot of fields this year, will have all those rootworms drowned. The eggs are very resistant to drowning. The larvae are not. And as I said, the hatch usually happens around the beginning of June. So most or all of our rootworms would have been hatched by the time we got these heavy rains, and therefore subject to this, to drowning. So a lot of dead rootworms as a result of the rain. So feel sorry for them if you can. Find it in your heart. So the other part, so the corn that comes out of that will be, there's a silver lining of all this, it won't be subject to heavy rootworm pressure or much rootworm pressure at all in those drowned out areas. It'll be, at least not have that to contend with as it regrows its roots. The other thing I wanted to mention is in those areas where the corn is dead and soybeans are planted, we'll run into some new territory in terms of our main soybean pest, which is soybean aphid. And that's usually a later season pest in Indiana. So later season meaning end of July and into early August. That's when we usually have had infestations on aphids, on soybeans rather. We don't have soybean aphids every year, and in fact most of the years recently we haven't had any. But we've never planted soybeans in July extensively in most of the northern parts of the state. So what will that do? What will that mean for soybean aphid? We just don't know. It's completely uncharted territory. So we'll see. It could be nothing. It could be something where growers have to spray beans when they wouldn't have had to otherwise. So we'll just have to stay tuned and see what happens there. We just don't know yet. We have no past history. So that's all I wanted to say about the insect side.
Any questions for Christian? Okay, we're going to turn our attention to another pest, which would be disease, and we have Kirsten Wise with us.
All right, thank you, Greg. Very similar to Christian, it's still a little bit unknown what's going to happen with some of the disease issues in Indiana this year. We do know that there are stand establishment problems in soybeans right now. You know, I think most people pay attention to the areas that have drowned out or flooded, but these are excessive saturated soils, which are great conditions for the organisms that cause seedling blights. And so even in some of the areas that haven't been drowned out, we'll have some problems with seeing some of these diseases appear in some of our younger soybeans. It's also important to remember that these early wet conditions are very conducive for infection by the fungus that causes sudden death syndrome, or SDS. And so when we have wet springs, saturated soils in the springs, lots of times we'll see SDS or brown stem rot appear later in August. And so it's important to keep that in the back of your mind as you start to think, you know, as State Fair wraps up, you know, we'll need to be looking in some of these fields for SDS. Growers that their fields are actually, you know, in the reproductive stages right now, the early reproductive stages, particularly in the northern part of the state, are at risk for white mold development. Fields that have had a history of white mold will need to be considered the costs of spraying a fungicide application. We recommend that application to go on at that early flowering or R1 stage. It could be pushed until R2, but we lose a lot of the efficacy from those products once we get past R2. And so I know the same kind of thing is going to be with corn, is that whether or not it's worth it to invest in another input in some of these crops, and so those are some considerations that farmers are going to have to think about carefully. On the corn standpoint, we've had a lot of humidity and we've had very frequent rainfalls, and so when we have frequent moisture and humidity, it's great conditions for foliar diseases of corn, and we're already starting to see some of these show up in fields. In particular, my main concern is with northern corn leaf blight. It was very common last year, which means that there's a lot of that fungus still around in the residue. We're already seeing lesions in some of our older corn, and so this is something that farmers are going to want to monitor. Scout fields prior to tasseling, or even in those late vegetative stages. And if we're seeing northern and it's a susceptible hybrid, and you still have good crop yield potential that you want to protect, a fungicide application may be warranted. But again, because of the crop prices and crop condition, these are all going to be factors that need to be considered more carefully than they have in the past. And other than that, I think, most of what we see show up for diseases will be weather dependent. And Ken talked about how difficult it is to predict what's going to happen in the coming month. And so, just like Christian, we'll have to stay tuned and see what diseases are showing up and when.
Thank you, Kirsten. Any questions for Kirsten? Okay, we'll turn our attention now to nutrients and nutrient management. I know there's a lot of questions on nitrogen and corn, and we're here with Jim Camerato.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Nitrogen's important for corn yield. On average, it doubles the yield of corn in Indiana, and in some of the regions of Indiana, it increases yield 4 or 5-fold. So it's very important for profit. It's also one of the most costly inputs for corn, and generally will cost over $100 an acre. So decisions about nitrogen in any year are important. Unfortunately, nitrogen is very mobile, and with excess rain, it can go up into the atmosphere or down into groundwater or tile drainage, so it can easily be lost from the soil. In this season, we have had a lot of nitrogen loss. So for growers, they need to, if they've put their nitrogen out already, they need to assess how much they've lost and consider making supplemental applications to recover some of that yield. Generally, half of a yield is not profitable, and for sure, a quarter of a yield will not return a profit. In some cases, growers have not been able to put their nitrogen out, and the important decision there is the health of that crop and whether it has the potential to respond to that additional nitrogen. And that requires assessment of the root system and the above ground part of the plant, and then making, again, a difficult decision on how much nitrogen they might need to apply. Bob mentioned earlier the Chat and Chew Cafe, where he has some articles related to excessive rainfall and flooding. There are some articles there related to nitrogen that will help growers make decisions about how much nitrogen they've lost and how much nitrogen they should add if it's warranted.
Any nutrient management questions for Jim? Chris?
Okay, so some of the corn is still small enough to use traditional side dress equipment if the fields firm up enough that you can put a tractor out. So that's just the typical method. Then the taller corn, we need some sort of a piece of equipment that can go over corn that's, say, more than 2 or 3 feet tall. Many areas have high clearance applicators that can apply liquid nitrogen. There's a few areas that have box spreaders on high clearance tractors as well. And in the past, when prices were good, we also had some helicopters and airplanes flying on nitrogen fertilizer. I think this year, given the economics, that the ground-driven equipment's going to be used more often.